Good evening or good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. Welcome. I am excited to have you here. So, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Today's discussion, could it happen here? What Minneapolis signals for Chicago and Black leadership was created in response to questions that we are hearing quietly but consistently from our members, our networks, and our communities. People are watching what's happening and taking place in Minneapolis and across America for that matter. And they're asking, what could it mean for Chicago? They're asking as leaders, as professionals, and as people who care deeply about the safety, the dignity, and the future of Black and Brown communities. And our goal today is not to predict outcomes or to amplify fear in any way. It is simply to slow the moment down, bring context to the headlines, and create space for informed leadership. And in moments like this, it's extremely important that silence can create more, that we have conversations around this, because we know that silence can create more anxiety than clarity. So the thoughtful conversation helps us to be able to lead responsibly. Just one second, let a few more people in here. Shaka, I just made you co-host. If I could have you let people in, if you see them popping in, and just join if you, both you and Latanda have the opportunity to do that. Thank you. So, Black professionals often sit at the intersection of leadership, community, trust, and accountability. And this conversation is about helping us to be able to think clearly about that in a responsible way. I also want to note that the views that we are going to be sharing here today, they reflect the perspectives of our panelists and myself, and not necessarily the formal positions that we hold with the National Black MBA Association or the organizations that they each work for and represent. With that, I will introduce myself and the panelists. My name is Israel Green. I am the president of the National Black MBA Association Chicago chapter, and I am also the founder and the owner of Mosaic Works and the chief strategy officer. We are a leadership development and DEI strategy firm working with organizations across the country. And I am so excited to have my esteemed panelists join me. With that, I will go through the introductions. If you get an opportunity, I highly recommend that you take the opportunity to do a little bit more research on each of these individuals, because what I'm going to be sharing with you does not do their bios justice at all. But first up, I want to introduce Michelle Garcia, who is the Deputy Legal Director at the ACLU of Illinois, where she leads impact litigation focused on civil rights, policing, and systemic discrimination. She is a former trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice and HUD, and she brings deep federal and state expertise on constitutional law, accountability, and government power. Michelle, thank you so much and welcome. Next up, we have Dr. Tracy Kesey, who is a retired police executive, former New York PD deputy commissioner, and co-founder of the Center for Police and Equity. She has led national and global efforts on equity in law enforcement, including serving on a United Nations expert mechanism advancing racial justice in policing worldwide, and is currently an associate professor of public safety and justice. Dr. Tracy Kesey, welcome to you. Thank you. And last but not least, rounding us out, we have Lieutenant Jermaine Harris, who is a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department and a nationally recognized leader in the community-centered public safety. He has advised multiple mayoral administrations, served on national policing reform bodies, and works at the intersection of violence prevention, equity, and law enforcement accountability. So, Michelle, Tracy, Jermaine, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to get this conversation started. So, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to open up the first question, share it with everyone, and then from there we'll do a round robin. And if you have some additional information that you would like to share, please feel free to lean into those questions, and we'd be more than happy to get those answers as well. If we do have time, we will take some answers or some questions from the audience as well. So, to ground us, I would love to start with just a question for all of you. And the first one is when you look at what is happening in Minneapolis, what feels most important for Chicago leaders and leaders around the country to understand right now and beyond the actual headlines? And Michelle, we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, when I look at the headlines in Minnesota, it sounds familiar. And what I'm saying is that I don't think Minnesota is the exception. It is what we've seen this administration do in Chicago, in California, in DC. And in particular, in many ways, the use of force against immigrants and citizens and the intensity that we see in Minnesota has already happened in Chicago under Midway Blitz. If you just look at the number of arrests involved, there are 2,000 arrests in Minnesota, immigration enforcement arrests, and Operation Midway Blitz, according to the ACLU's case against the Department of Homeland Security, over 3,300 immigration-related arrests. And those included both citizens, both people with lawful permitted status. The similar sorts of racial profiling that we're seeing in Minnesota has already happened in Chicago earlier this year, as well as the excessive use of force against bystanders, against people protesting. The ACLU had a lawsuit along with many civil rights organizations against Bovino and the Department of Homeland Security for how they responded to protesters here in Chicago, clergy who wanted to just visit people at Broadview Processing Center. And it goes without saying that there have been people that have died in Chicago. Silvera Villegas is a perfect example. A father, too, was stopped at a traffic stop and killed by ICE. And this happened right after he dropped off his two U.S. citizens in school. So at the same time, what is good about Minnesota is that we're seeing a national recognition that this is wrong and that there is national pressure for change. And I think that we're at a momentum where change could be happening, where the narrative that the Trump administration has put out that immigrants are primarily criminals, that it's only going to be affecting a small group of people and not our larger communities is just frankly not true. But in many ways, I think Minnesota is a reflection of what we've seen from the ACLU in Chicago already. And the notion that that this is specific to one area of the country is just not true.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Michelle. Let's jump over to Tracy.
Thank you. And thank you for that, Michelle, too, for starting that grounding. But I want to back up just a little bit. Absolutely, we are not seeing anything new here. And that includes Chicago, you name any city, any urban city, right? We have a history of this kind of interaction. So whether it be with your local law enforcement or federal law enforcement. So it's not new. And for Black leaders, neither is sitting in that intersection of who you are and then your community and the struggle of how to address those issues while also managing yourself, right? So I think one of the things that Minnesota has brought back to us, again, this is not new, but we can talk about the homicide of Mr. Floyd, where we, again, said we need change and want change. And what we often get as Black leaders is lip service. We don't have anything structurally that will make this not happen again. We can go back to history lessons. And I'm old, I'm a grandmother. We can go back to when I was on the force in 1989 and we were talking about Rodney King. There was a call for change then. We know systemically that there are things that we are really needing to take care of. And when we try to do those things, it's met with resistance. And sometimes it's met with resistance with people who look like us. And one of the things that I think that Minnesota is really reckoning with is that honest conversation about why here again, right? Because it wasn't the first time. but why are we still having the same conversations? And I think it's important for us to look at not just conditions and narratives. This administration was clear from the get-go what was going to happen. What we're not saying is that there was a specific group it was geared to happen to. And when that did not happen and it just added on, or I would say it included other people, then all of a sudden there's a pressure now to have a conversation about change. So I don't know about everybody else, but I can tell you that we know what happens and why these things happen. The right question is to ask is, why do we allow them to happen and to continue to happen? And are we stepping up and standing up for the right thing? Because we are always happy when we get this kind of attention, but we never get long sustaining change. And we don't mean reimagining, we mean change. And that requires you to look at structures. And we do this, we tinker around the edges of structures, and then 10 or 15 years or even 5 years later, we are all grabbing pearls trying to understand, why are we here again? We know why we are here again. And to Michelle's point, you now have just changed the focus on a different community. But the tactics, the narrative, the rhetoric, the threats, all of that is still the same. And so for Chicago, who has been through a lot from their own history, there's plenty to go back to and learn about what worked, what didn't work. But we're not asking the harder questions of our leadership, and even for Black leadership. We are in this, again, and we call it this intersection, but we are in a double bind of not only how we show up for our communities, but how do we show up for ourselves as individuals. But we have to be realistic that we have bills to pay, we have children to raise, and we're trying to balance that and still be authentic while you're in a system that does not allow you to be authentic. So I think that we have been here before. I am 100% on board with Michelle in, there's things that we say we want change. We're going to have to be a little bit more strategic, and we're going to have to meet the challenge, because folks aren't playing by the old rules anymore, but yet we still want to hang out with the old rules. So I think there's plenty of things we can learn from Minneapolis. And one of those things was just that, right? When the community says we are not doing this anymore and again, and we are going to force things to happen, a lot of these things have to come from the ground. And a lot of those things have to not only come from the ground, then leadership also needs to rise to the occasion of what people are asking you to do. So I agree that I think there's some things from Minneapolis that we can learn, but my biggest concern is that we have been here and coming back and again and still, doing the same thing over and over again. They have a definition for that. And I think it's time for us to look at that a bit different. So.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Tracy. And I do want to definitely get into some of the systems that are in place that could be impacting this and or preventing advancement from happening as it is. The question that we're talking about right now is, when you look at what's happening in Minneapolis, what feels most important for Chicago leaders to understand right now beyond the headlines? And Jermaine, I'm going to have you wrap it up with this question.
Yeah, I think between the first two answers, right, there's not much left to cover. But one thing I want to bring up, though, specifically is, just as an active current law enforcement professional, how does that affect what we're doing? How does that affect the way in which I'm, approaching officers that work with me, specifically as a supervisor? Because the biggest challenge or problem or deficiency that I see in these situations is a combination. One, you have individuals wearing masks, anonymity, without an identity, right? Working in any type of thing. I don't care what job you are going to present someone, you remove their identity, give them anonymity, that is a recipe for chaos. And the second challenge is a lack of supervision. When you're watching a video, can anyone identify who the supervisor is in any ICE video? Does any supervisor step up and say, hey, I'm going to handle this and talk with people or work with the community? I've yet to see that. So these problems, you have lack of supervision plus no identity, and anonymity doing anything. This becomes a problem. So, but what that does for me is that is really encouraging to see a failure, but then recognize as an opportunity that I can prevent it, that I can influence it, that I could somehow instruct or teach officers here in Chicago from that. Specifically just around this idea of how we're trained. Like Chicago was just on a national scale with the DNC. We had large protests, large scale attention on the city. And for the most part, we acted very professionally and got lots of compliments from our approach and how we handled the DNC. We spent years training for that, going through scenarios, rehearsing situations, having supervisors out there giving directions, being able to recognize, being in constant communication. We're looking at ICE agents, and if you understand how federal systems work, it's a national. Someone can get hired in Idaho, and a week later they're in Chicago on a street they've never been to, never seen, in a community they've never interacted. So now you're taking people without this training, without this supervision, in anonymity, placing them into these communities. And so what I could understand and quickly see, just being in the profession and understanding the culture, they're probably getting pep talks prior to being deployed or prior to going out. Just like in a football game or any way, you're preparing to face the opponent and the enemy. I can imagine, I could see it, not even being there, I could actually see them in roll call being prepped to go to war, being prepped. They're going to attack. They're going to come for you. We're not going to put up with this. I could see it and I could understand it because it happens in policing. So now you're just having all of these things that are coming together and being presented, and where we can't be surprised, right? To Dr. Kesey's, we can't be surprised these things are happening because it's being engineered and being developed that way. But I think there's a really great opportunity for us in Chicago, specifically for the supervisors who work in police departments here. Like, this is a way to double down on those efforts, a way to double down on your community policing, double down on your leadership principles, double down on this idea of understanding how important it is to reform our culture, because that's going to stop something like this from happening. We're always this close, right? In America, we're always this close, right, to something exploding or blowing up, and it just takes that catalyst and that torch. So we're not preparing for it, and we're not really in this situation to really address those issues. We're going to be faced with this cycle. We saw that within George Floyd. The greatest opportunity probably in our lifetimes that we had to push reform, and we ended up with a lot of short steps, half measures. One of the greatest opportunities, right, to not let George Floyd die in vain, but have this be a way in which we could change policing, right, for the future. And we dropped it in a lot of ways because so much of our leadership was just really bent on these old school ways, this resilience, this reluctancy, to change, and just that adversarial approach to it made such a problem. So I know for me, if this becomes something that encourages me to really dig in and embrace being a leader, being a supervisor in policing, because there's an opportunity to influence the young officers that are watching this, that may be developing their own understanding of it without that support, that I can have this conversation and talk through. Here's the failures, here's the opportunities, and help them see that. And my hope is, my vision is that when this situation happens, because it will happen again, right, in our department or within the officers that work for me, they're going to step up and we're going to be proud of their responses, right? That's my goal. That's my goal.
Yep. Thank you for that. A couple of things that you all said. One, Jermaine, that you mentioned is the fact that you've got the leadership that needs to step up, be visible out in the streets. I think that creates a level of trust. I think also what's lacking is that the transparency is not there in terms of people wearing masks, pulling up in just unmarked vehicles and just random jumping out of their car. That would be terrifying to anyone. So I do appreciate the fact that you're talking about leadership being in the streets and the trenches and being identifiable in that group. Tracy, something that you mentioned, and I think I did a disservice when we named this session of could it happen here? Because the reality is it has happened here already. And you mentioned that. And I do want to call out Miramar Martinez last year, I think around October, who was shot 5 times from Chicago. And this has already happened here. And the rhetoric around that, when I was watching some of the Congress, the testimony that's taking place now, and just what unfolded in that. So people that are watching this, it is already here. And I don't say that to put fear in anyone's eyes or, make people terrified. But we do want to make sure that we are acknowledging the things that people have been through in the community and that are going through, and that this isn't something new, but it is at our doorstep already. Michelle, I want to start with you on this, and we're switching gears, really talking about setting the stakes and diagnosing the moment. And, starting with you, to kind of ground us in the legal and the civil rights context, if you could just kind of briefly tell us from a legal and civil rights perspective, what should people in Chicago understand about what is at stake in moments like this, particularly those that are immigrants, those from the LGBTQIA plus community, and the minority communities at large?
Sure, that's a great question. I think that the overall theme is that no community is safe and that no civil right is in isolation, right? The right for a trans family to seek medical care about their child with their doctor is directly related to a woman's right to control her body. Everything is interconnected, and in part because we're dealing unprecedented federal administration, right? There's a concerted effort by this administration to maintain a white male Christian nationalist supremacy. And I use that word supremacy on purpose. One of the cases that the ACLU has, it's getting a lot of attention, is that we're doing in partnership with the NAACP, LDF. And we are challenging the Trump administration's executive order, which defines who's a U.S. citizen. And in particular, his executive order says that children who are born in the U.S., where one parent may not be documented or has a different type of documentation, those children are not U.S. citizens. And so we filed a class action with LDF and the Asian Law Caucus and Democracy Defenders, and obtained an injunction because we believe that executive order, you can't use an executive order to get around the 14th Amendment, right? And we all know what the 14th Amendment was about, right? 14th Amendment was Reconstruction era that guaranteed people born in this country and naturalized are U.S. citizens. And it was designed to provide citizenship to Black people, formerly enslaved people. And so the notion that one civil right is not connected to another community or one protected group is not connected is just frankly wrong, because there's a national agenda to undermine any community that's different than this current administration. So I think that's what's at stake here. Right? It's not a situation of, immigration enforcement, it's only about criminals. No. In Illinois, we have a case against the Department of Homeland Security with the National Immigrant Justice Center, just merely addressing whether ICE agents were doing these warrantless arrests. And we found in that case that the majority of the people that they were arresting without warrants, which is illegal under the Fourth Amendment and illegal under their own immigration law, had no criminal history. So this is not the narrative that they're spinning, that this cannot happen to you because you're not part of this community, is just false. And that what I think we should be taking away is that any sort of threat can impact you, whether or not you're a member of that particular community.
I often see us sitting in a space where sometimes we have a level of privilege depending on who we are and the circumstances. And when I talk about privilege, most people hear and think that only cis white men have this level of privilege, but each of us have a level of privilege depending on the circumstances and that point in time. And oftentimes we will sit back and think, okay, you know what, it's not happening to me, or I'm here legally. And because the narrative is different than what is truly taking place in the streets. And I think it's important for us to understand that is like, okay, you know what? No, this is not separate from you. This is part of you. It's part of the people that surround you. It's your neighbors, and it could happen to you at any given point in time. And we have to be cognizant of that, which is why it's important to have these conversations. So thank you for bringing that point up and clarifying that. Jermaine, staying with the idea of what's at stake, I want to shift from legal frameworks to lived reality. Where do you see the biggest gap between public safety policy specifically, and the day-to-day reality that's taking place in Chicago and places like Minneapolis and LA?
Yeah, lived experience, probably one of the most important skills or trainings that I've received, right, as a as a public safety professional, was just the fact that I have the luxury of being able to work in the community that I grew up in and I currently live in. So a lot of times we talk about research and talk about studies, which are valuable, but a lot of what I'm based on is what I'm looking out my window, right? What I'm seeing out of the window. And I think that part really connect with people when you can understand where they're coming from. Because as police, we just the legal structure, we're always looking for a defense or some sort of explanation for why things happen, right? It's some sort of justification. But many times people don't want to hear that, right? Sometimes they just want to understand, do you recognize where I'm coming from, right? I'll have a mom whose son may have been pulled over and was treated poorly, and she's telling me, explaining me the story, right? Typically, what officers will do is, well, was he running, did he drive fast, or why didn't he show us? We're looking for some sort of justification for the treatment. But what really works is put myself in that situation with my own son. How would I feel? I'd be frustrated, I'd be upset, and I'd be afraid. I'd recognize that, and let's start from there, right? And then we can start working on the solutions. But it really just starts with that basic piece. So when we start to talk about the opportunity, the piece that's missing, and where the gap lives, it's really in just basic understanding how people are feeling in a moment or feeling within a situation. Any meeting we're going to do, conversation we're going to have, we got to level set there first. Right? This is creating this sort of frustration, emotion, or whatever the challenge may be within you. I recognize that. I acknowledge it. It's valid. If I was in that situation, empathetically, I could understand. And then now let's move on, right? We skip that far too much. We end up fighting and going against each other, just constantly trying to prove our own points versus trying to solve problems or solve issues. So I want to always start there with just understanding that value of lived experience. And then the other piece, right? Michelle talked about how these issues and problems may not specifically address you at this moment, but it definitely will, just because of precedent, because of policy, because all of these things are creating the standard from which we go forward in the future. And that is a huge problem. No one understands that more, right, than Black America. That the issues in which we face, whether it's civil rights, whether it's police brutality, police violence, all these issues have so often affected our community, and people would justify, or why didn't he just comply? Or why did he just, like, all of these issues and things would come up because it wasn't happening to a particular community or a particular part of society. And then when these tables start to turn, we saw it in COVID, people who understood food insecurity and fear for the first time in their lives and the panic that it caused, right? And these things are going to face you when we don't address and create structures and create systems that when you're down in that situation, it is going to definitely absolutely affect you. And so when just to kind of get it without going too deep into a whole like deep thought of it, with just understanding that piece, I think the opportunity for us, the piece where it comes from anyone who may be watching or who may be trying to figure out what exactly that I could do, I think the most important thing for us to do is to really start to have conversations with people who are affected, to start to understand where they're coming from, the emotion that it's creating, what are the opportunities there to support, because one day I might need that. One day I may need to understand the situation. One day I need to coach my own nephew or my own son or daughter through these situations. So let's take this as an opportunity to have these conversations with people with those lived experiences. And I live in a community here in North Lawndale in the city that neighbors Little Village, which is a large American Mexican immigrant population. And just having conversations with my neighbors, one of those big things is I'm like, how can I help? What can I do? A lot of times it's just like taking the fact of trying to recognize and taking the time to talk with me and understand what I'm going through, having these conversations matters because we feel alone, right? That part matters. So that's the little thing that you can do, right? Not everyone's a protester. Not everyone's really to risk it all, right? But what you can do is to just go out and have a conversation with a person who's living through this to better understand, to figure out ways that you can support them through it. And I guarantee you it's going to help you later on down the road when something like this happens to you. Because it will, right? We understand Americans.
Yeah. Jermaine, I love the fact that you and appreciate the position that you take from policing the area in which you grew up. And I think that allows you to lead with the level of empathy that is oftentimes missed by most. And even taking the time to connect and have the conversation with someone and understand, you may not You can't fully gauge where they've been, but if we have those conversations, it helps us to better understand and be more empathetic to what's taking place. And that way, whenever something is happening, they feel like they're not alone. And I believe that's extremely important to do that. Tracy, I want to zoom out from the local experience and look at the system as a whole for a moment. When assessing whether a city's public safety system is resilient or fragile, what indicators are most important and that come to mind for you?
It's a great question. And I want to just, when I see Lieutenant Harris talk, just my faith in humanity comes back, right? Because when you've been doing it this long, you're thinking, please let somebody be able to pick up the mantle. But in regards to data, and the question is a really good one. When we talk about broadly, how do we start to look at those indicators? They're going to look different from department to department, but there are some similarities when we talk about is there stress on those particular public safety systems that create what's happening. And let's start internally first, because often we don't. Our first move is to say, what does the community do, or what do we need to do with community? And I always tell chiefs, and I also tell my students that if your house is in disarray, then your officers will go out and they will behave the way that they are treated internally. And that means if you don't have legitimacy and you don't have a due process or systems in which you have procedurally just spaces put in there, they're going to react exactly how we would expect them to react. A lot of agencies that we see will have early warning systems that will be able to tell you if there's certain levels of use of force or excessive use of force that are going into play. We really heavily rely on that supervisory level to be able to go in and to correct the behavior early. Oftentimes, those things will work and they don't work. If we are solely relying on aggregate data, and this goes back to what Lieutenant Harris was speaking about, and we're not having the conversations with the officers themselves and with the community themselves, then we miss a huge piece. The other part of it too is that you'll start to have internally what we call organizational noise, right? So you're going to have folks who are not showing up for work. There's sick time. They're late all the time if they show up at all. You will have a lot of questioning around policies, discipline, complaint backlogs. I mean, you'll have all kinds of things internally for an organization, a public safety organization, where they can begin to know that something is happening. And that is if you have leadership that has been trained in how to identify and to be able to, and we have empathy even internally, to relate to what officers, supervisors, and managers are going through or what you're asking them to do. So it also requires that leadership to have a humongous amount of self-reflective behavior to be able to say, am I showing up? Am I leading? Am I doing what I'm asking them to do? Because that is really the number one signal that something is happening when you say, do as I say, not as I do, right? And then all of a sudden the cops are starting to talk, and then the unions, and we go in and we go on from there. But when we're talking about external, and I always say when the community looks in, the headlines, they don't need headlines to know that something is happening inside an organization, because it's happening in their interactions. And when you have officers that are rude, when you have officers that are cursing, and they've been trained to believe that if you do that in a specific community, you can gain compliance, then you know that you have issues that are happening. And I think what also happens here is when we talk about data, we really get stuck on the aggregate. And what's important about the aggregate is the ability to disaggregate, right? Because we need to know which neighborhood these things are happening in. We need to know what groups of officers or units these pieces are happening in. So you can begin to then review policy. You can begin to bring in what I consider to be external stakeholders and begin to shift some of that power of accountability to those stakeholders to help you with that. So I think as you hear a lot of things happening with not just with ICE, but you have this confounding and conflation of folks in uniform all behave the same. So even if there wasn't any markers on their uniforms, most community members don't differentiate that behavior or what is happening or what is going on. So they will oftentimes sort of lay over. If I have a Chicago PD interaction and it's a negative one, then I always will say, well, I expected ICE to act that way. right? Look what's happening here. I'm being treated the same way. So the aggregated data is always going to be important, but you cannot separate that from the lived experience and the stories that also accompany that, because the context of it also can change the way that you use data. I think really for me, what the bigger flags are for organizations when they're not paying attention to data, it really is how are you acting after incident? How do you go in and do, as Lieutenant said, you begin to start to justify things. And we saw this with the early deaths we had with ICE, right? So without an investigation, we automatically say, hey, they followed policy. I don't know about you, LT, but I cringed. I said, yeah, there's no way. You know that, right? Not without an investigation, not without collecting the evidence, but the immediacy of defending behavior that has not been evaluated is a danger. But I also have to let you know that that action is also what a lot of officers want to have happen. They want their leadership to back them unequivocally when something happens, because there is a safety measure there that says that I may have done something wrong, I'm not even sure myself, but to then sort of feed me to the lions without having any kind of protection or as someone to stand up for me, then also impacts my behavior on how I'm going to engage moving forward. That's externally and internally.
Well, you said a lot there. The part that does not sit well with me is when they do say, hey, all right, you know what, we'll check it out, we'll investigate ourselves. And it's like, okay, well, what is that body that is outside to investigate you? So they come back, 2 hours later, yeah, we investigated ourselves and we're good. There's a flaw in the system here that I don't think anyone thought of, or if they did, they thought, how can we get around it? And this administration has figured out how to do just that, unfortunately. I want to jump
really quick though.
Yeah,
if I could really quick to that point, my apologies for interrupting you. But what you saw or what you're seeing is not new. It is the reason why policing was forced into, in most cases, not all, into getting body-worn cameras, into getting oversight boards, into having outside investigators when officers are involved in line of duty deaths. And so it's one of those things where I know it may feel like it's new for folks and why don't they have oversight, but this is really, some of this is back to the civil rights area. A lot of this though is post George Floyd. We were talking about the exact same things. So I just wanted to add that nugget, and I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
That made me feel some kind of way when you said that. I just want to let you know, not in a bad way, but I needed to lift it.
Yeah, and once again, we're seeing this much of a picture that is this broad, and we get really caught up whenever we see that image, and we immediately go to it, and we don't understand all the different pieces. And that's why I love having a panel like all of you all, where there's years and years of experience that you all are bringing, both from doing the work, both from the policy side, the system side, and the legal side. So thank you for that. I want to jump to early signals, some misalignment, and some system stress, and talk a little about what that looks like. Michelle, when people ask, could this happen here? Could this happen to me? That question often comes with a sense of uncertainty before anything visible has ever happened. There's just panic, unfortunately. When communities ask that question, what legal warning signs are there that tend to show up before a crisis becomes, this mountain or this volcano and erupts? What legal warning signs are there? Uh-oh, I think you may be on mute.
I don't necessarily think that there are necessarily legal warning signs, right? I think for some of the things that Tracy talked about, sort of historical systems are in play, right? Particularly with policing, and it is only the changes have come as a result, oftentimes, of moments of crisis, whether it's the shooting of Laquan McDonald, of George Floyd. That has been sort of the public outrage, that whether you're in it, at a police department or at a particular organization and doing work in the inside, having that exterior pressure gives that legitimacy for change. So I don't necessarily think that there are legal things that necessarily, I don't know if your question is, when should I panic? I think that
let's jump to the question of what are my rights? So when we see this taking place in society and you get pulled over and people are like, well, just comply. And possibly already your rights have been violated. So at what point do you just sit down, shut up and deal with it later? But what are the rights in those situations?
So there's some pretty simple rights. If you find yourself interacting with law enforcement or ICE in a location, including your workplace or out in the community, you have the right to remain silent, right, under the Fifth Amendment, whether questioned or arrested by immigration officers. You have the right to remain calm. You should keep your hands where the officer can see them, but you have the right to ask to speak to an attorney. You're not required to discuss your immigration status or citizenship status with the police and immigration officers or officials, and you're not required to sign anything that you don't understand, and you shouldn't. Those are sort of the big things for interacting, right? If an officer knocks at your door at home, you have the right not to open the door. We have this thing called the Fourth Amendment that protects us against unreasonable searches and seizures. It is and really, in order for there to be that search, there needs to be that probable cause that, a crime is about to be committed, or there's items that could substantiate particular crime in that space. But you don't have to open your door, right? In order for an ICE agent to come in, they have to have a warrant signed by a judge who's made that determination of sort of the legal standard. An ICE administrative warrant is not enough. A warrant saying that they could deport you is not enough. And the same thing happens with law enforcement, right? They cannot enter without that judicial warrant. Unless, of course, you consent to let them in, right? So to have that conversation with your family members. And finally, one of the things to be thinking about is that obviously your safety matters. We've seen so many things with interactions, whether it's with police or with ICE agents, where things have gone bad very quickly. And so it is very important to think about your safety first. So if they are busting in your house, step back. Say you don't want to use your body in those sort of situations, but you should say, I don't consent to what you're doing. I don't consent to what you're doing. Right. And if you are on the street and you are seeing immigration activity, which we know happened in Chicago, and we see people do things that are, using force against other people, if you feel safe to do so, step back from the situation. You have the right under the First Amendment to record. And record the activity with your phone, write down any relevant information, always be very careful not to interfere or obstruct, because that could be considered a federal crime or a basis for them taking action against you. But one of the things that we've seen from Minnesota and in Chicago is when people take out their phones, it is a way to hold people accountable against the narrative in a way that's extremely powerful. And you have the right to protest. And if your rights are being infringed on, we want to know at the ACLU. We want to know because we are working in partnership with other civil rights organizations, community members, to vindicate people's rights, whether it's in court or through advocacy. So those are the sort of the big things to think about. and the big things the Constitution does to protect you. But the reality is that, your safety is important. And sometimes it is the rights alone will not necessarily protect you, and your ability to make change, your ability to protect others, you have to make those choices and thinking about your safety at the same time. And sometimes the best way to do it is to step back, observe, document, report, and share your information in a safe way.
I hear you. I just, when we watch what's taking place and we see the way that it unfolds, and people are filming legally, and then their phone is stripped from their hands and they're thrown to the ground, or their phone is stomped on, or any number of things that are taking place, it's almost as though the rules for ICE and Border Patrol are different than the rules for a city policing. And
Well,
that I think that's where a big portion of the confusion lies, or at least it does for me.
the rules aren't different. I think that what we've found, there's been more community activism, there's been more lawsuits. The Chicago Police Department isn't reforming themselves just because they want to. There's a federal consent decree in place that community members have fought for decades. So the rules are the same. We just haven't seen the same amount of outrage and activism as community members, or the connection that the Constitution works the same for both entities. But there's no distinction on the rules. We're also seeing an administration that doesn't care about the rules and are choosing to make these actions. And so that is frightening and troublesome. But the only way to hold them accountable is by sharing what's happening, and by demanding action, whether it's through legislation, through changes in policy, litigation, and exposing what's happened.
Thank you for that. Jermaine, I want to jump over to you for a minute, and maybe if you can take a couple of minutes on this question. From your experience inside law enforcement and in the community work, what feels most misunderstood about how public safety operates on the ground?
I think because the last question you proposed for Michelle, with the idea, I think I want to take a little bit more from it, right? She's 100% correct. The Constitution applies no matter where you are. You're in America, right? These rules, these standards, these protections, these liberties all exist. But where the variations come in are in policy. So one of the rules, so we could take, for example, something like a protection with case law, right? So much of what we do in policing is based on case law, right? A decision gets made, everyone gets their Miranda rights because that was a case law that happened, right? Which had to give your rights before interrogation. So take one, for example, such as the fleeing felony. This is Tennessee versus Gardner, right? It's one of those laws, a case law protection, that grants the police officer the authority to use deadly force if someone commits a felony and then tries to run away, right? The officer has to articulate the need, the risk to public safety, has to articulate the potential that the person may cause harm. But essentially, commit a felony, you try to get away, we can shoot. That's the case law. When we start to look at policies that get made, Chicago police, we're far more restrictive. You're going to have to label a whole lot of more articulations in order to even use. We don't even talk about the fleeing felon rule here. You're going to need a whole lot of more stipulations in order to use deadly force. Because essentially, there's a larger, broader, even in federal law, that's larger, broader. And then within a state, within a county, within a city, we can be more restrictive, right? And so those are what happens to policies. And so what typically the interactions that a person may have with a local municipal police officer, a federal officer may not be governed by those same policies, right? Some of the basic things, right? Even how we use force and how we articulate it and the reports that we're required to make and the transparency and how we reveal things online and how you can review body cams. Like all of these things are policies that we have created within our city, but at a federal level, they're not going to be as restrictive. You're always going to see the restrictions are always going to get tighter the lower you get to the ground, the lower the level is. So just in understanding that, most people don't realize that, right? They're going and expecting, well, hey, with Chicago police, I get this or I do that. And then you go to the federal department, like, no, it doesn't fly that way. So you always got to be careful, right, in these situations. And you're recording, you don't go in and record. These phones got 3 levels of zoom. You don't need to be that close to anyone for them to snatch your phone from you. Hit that level 5 zone on your iPhone. You can see, you can read everything on the ID card. So it's just like being safe and smart. I know we get excited, get riled up, and you want to get out there and you want to try and help and you want to try and support. But it's going to fall within that service of some sort of police function. You don't get in, you cannot interfere. It's not going to work out well for you. And these situations where people are doing things and they're getting themselves hurt, I'll tell exactly what I'll tell my own son and my own family, right? I do not want to write on your gravestone, he was right, right? That doesn't help, right? So in these situations, you got to be smart with how far you're putting yourself at risk and at danger, right? I want you to live to tell the story, right? Versus taking these risks. So I just wanted to kind of point that piece out. I just lost track of your question. Give me a little bit of it again. I'll get back to it. But I just wanted to I think that's important for people to understand there's these differences in policies that everything's not going to work out the way you do it with the Chicago police officer.
Yep. It was really about what feels most misunderstood about how public safety operates on the ground. Tracy mentioned this, like where we see one person do something and we paint the entire force by that one experience. Or there's some other things that are misunderstood.
Yeah, and I think the other part too is even the use of force itself. We only see when things go wrong, whether it's a mental health crisis, whether it's we only see when they go wrong. Nobody cares about a story when officers show up because of someone's loved one is going through mental crisis. We coax them and talk them down. They ride the ambulance and they go to the hospital. No one cares. That will never get more than one view. So we're only going to see the negatives when things don't work well. And the risk of that is it starts to overshadow when things work well because officers are going to be like, well, I've done this and done that. I've watched body cam videos of an officer who had 100% legal authority to use force and didn't because they were trying so hard to de-escalate and talk this down at the risk of getting themselves killed and hurt. I see that far more often than I see actual use of force. But we don't get that story because it's just not shared. So I just want people to understand that there are lots of officers who the last thing they ever want to do is to take someone's life. And they're doing everything possibly that they can to avoid that from happening. And it's across races. I'm seeing white officers with a black offender or black. I'm seeing black officers with it's going across the board when it comes racially. We just don't see it. And the negative incidents, I think, should get brought to the forefront, but it can't become the entire narrative because we're going to overshadow the progress of things that are going on. And so I do want people to have some faith, encouragement, and optimism that we can improve. And the way it's going to work out the best is that when people are actually getting involved. I do so much work in community policing. I work with stakeholders across community, whether it's youth organizations, people are working with returning citizens, people are doing economic workforce development, and you're seeing all the progress and the things that are happening. And I can go into this space as a police officer and have a conversation with someone who has a criminal background, who's a convicted felon, who's experienced and been just as involved, and see each other as a human and see our humanity and recognize that there's still opportunity there. And the progress is unbelievable, right, when these type of things happen. But it's people getting involved. And I think that's the part that has to be brought up. Can't just only focus on the negative and things will go bad because we're going to lose all the opportunities for things to go well. And we are seeing improvements, right? We are seeing violence reductions within the city of Chicago. We are seeing these things happen. But still, as back to what Michelle talked about, still the greatest concentration of violence involvement, of victimization, is the African American community. 8 out of 10 people killed in Chicago are Black. 8 out of 10. The city itself, we've looked at, the University of Chicago has done research about the concentration of violent crime, and you can see the majority of crime that's happening across the entire south side of Chicago is concentrated on just 8% of blocks, this tiny little concentrational area. The west side of Chicago, predominantly represented in violence involvement by just 5% of the blocks. These are making up to account for all these murders, all this violence and things that are happening. But people I don't get the same sort of excitement and energy around supporting this 5% and these 8% of blocks, because again, it's not going to happen to me, right? That's a problem over there, and that's their issue within that space. But we got to get involved. Got to understand that the progress is there and it's happening. The only way to fuel to keep that going is going to be us caring, paying attention, uplifting, telling the stories, because the instant we go silent, we become complacent. It's going to push us back so far, right? It needs us as a community and as a people to keep these issues relevant, keep them pertinent. Because again, this will end, right? We're going to get a new president. We may get a new administration. Things are going to shift, and we won't be in this time anymore. But does that mean we no longer care about immigration? Does that mean we no longer care about these issues? Unfortunately, in America, yeah, that's what it means, right? We're going to move on to the next topic. But for our communities and for our people, we have to keep that at the front, and we have to keep the pressure and the foot on the gas in order to get us where we need to be.
Thank you for that. I know we're getting close to wrapping up. I would love to just kind of do a round robin and just get one final closing thought from each of you, maybe 45 seconds to a minute. Tracy, if you could share one final closing thought that you have or any additional pieces.
I'm laughing because LT is doing the same thing I'm doing. Is that possible? Yeah. I would say there's a couple things happening here, and I would encourage, especially Black leadership, is to not only have this conversation, we also have our own internal community issues, much as what LT has just mentioned, that we are not even talking about, that are also contributing to conditions. And I'm not saying conditions should set you up to be killed. That's not what I'm talking about. But we know historically, when we talk about how do we invest in things, how do we invest in people, that it is a statement about your priorities, about what communities you invest in and which ones you don't. And I think that is also things that have to be brought to the table. But for the most part, I would encourage all of Black leadership to start talking about what is happening. We do behind closed doors, and we know we've made statements about, yeah, I'm tired, I'm not coming in, I'm not coming to the party on this one. But we are not really strategically looking at what are those things that we should be doing to counter what is happening. The lesson from Minneapolis is readiness, assessing your conditions. To the LT's point, is your responses ready? Have they been trained? Do they understand what you're asking them to do? And I think this is a really good time for all of those folks to be at the table to say, let's figure out if A happens, B happens, and it happens in the way in which we agree, and the community has said, this is what it means for us to be safe. So I'll stop there. That's what I would change.
Wonderful. Thank you. Michelle, you're on mute.
First, learn how to unmute. Then I would say, there's many ways to be an activist, right? You don't have to show up to a protest. You can have the conversations that Tracy talked with your communities and your members and your neighbors, as has been already talked about today, right? To get yourself educated. I think that encouraging people to be involved in some way beyond conversation is critical. Whether it's calling senators who are voting on funding for ICE, whether it is holding them accountable and saying, look, if my local police department has to have body-worn cameras, why doesn't ICE have body-worn cameras? It's the same sort of notion that we need these fundamental accountability measures, whether it's for training, as the lieutenant talked about, how using it as an internal training tool. I think that's important that we have police use those tools, but it's also important to have that public accountability that Dr. Kesey talked about. So be involved and encourage the people that you interact with to be involved in many ways, whether it's joining a local organization, giving money. There's so many ways to rise up to the moment. There's no one way to resist. There's no one way to move for change. And in our, the civil rights movement has not stopped, and that, but let's not get complacent. It is easy to be overwhelmed, and little steps do make a difference. I am telling you from a nonprofit organization, little steps do make a difference. And so I would encourage you to get involved. And showing up today for this conversation, you can already pat yourself on the back. That's getting involved, right? And continue to do that.
Thank you. Jermaine, how about for you?
Yeah, those are both the points that I was gonna say. So I don't have anything left, but the only point that I'll offer and that I'll bring up, just from the standpoint of our knowledge and of our awareness of history, and to recognize that things repeat, things happen within cycles, and to be conscious of the fact that we've been here before, we've learned these lessons, and at what point are we going to start implementing these lessons that we've learned? And that speaks to Michelle's point of putting the pressure and having the conversations with our officials to say, hey, we've been here, we've done this, and we're still facing the same situations. There has to be some sort of accountability that happens within policymakers and leadership to say, hey, we can't keep doing the same.
Wonderful. Thank you. As a part 2 to this, I will be reaching out to each of you to get some additional resources that you all might recommend, either that we read or just policy or anything that can be helpful to us. And we'll share that out to our membership base at large as well. As we close, I want to thank each of you. Michelle, thank you. Dr. Kesey, thank you. Lieutenant, thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you for your honesty, your clarity, and just the depth of the conversation that many people are having quietly, if at all. And today was not really about reaching consensus or offering easy answers in any way. It's really about naming what leadership actually requires in moments like these, where we're uncertain, we're scared, and we're frustrated, and paying attention and making sure that before the crisis forces our hand, we're asking better questions. We're resisting the urge to simplify complex systems into these sound bites that get the likes or get the thumbs up. And if there is one takeaway for me, it's this: what happens next is shaped long before breaking news alerts. It's shaped by the systems we tolerate, the questions that we tend to avoid, and the leadership that we practice when no one is watching. And Chicago's and America's future, for that matter, will not be determined by fear or speculation. It's going to be determined by whether leaders are willing to stay engaged, whether they're going to be informed and accountable, even when the answers are uncomfortable. So thank you all for being part of this conversation, for showing up as leaders who care about getting it right and not just getting through it. With that, thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.